Kia ora koutou. No mai haere mai, ki tēnā koutou. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Nice to see lots of very friendly faces in the room. I was thinking about how to pitch today's presentation. We've had the opportunity to present to a couple of audiences now over at the ASB conference in Australia on this project and more recently to ABI rehabilitation, where most of the audience were clinical researchers or clinicians working in brain injury. And so the focus of those presentations was really trying to make visible some of our learnings around setting up a peer support service and what we've learned along the way in implementing this trial that we can share with services. Today I was thinking we mostly will have a more academic audience, although I'm really pleased to see you here, Stacey. And so I'm trying to straddle both sharing some of our learnings of running a pragmatic trial with people with brain injury in the COVID context, which has had a range of challenges but also opportunities that have come from that, as well as along the way hopefully giving you some insights into some of what we've learned from the people that we've engaged with over that time as well. So hopefully the balance works for everyone. So I guess the first question is why peer support after brain injury? There's a few reasons for this really. Peer support is a source of support that draws on the lived experience of people. So in this case, a peer support person will be someone who has lived experience of brain injury and has the potential to share their expertise, knowledge and learnings with other people with brain injury. There's a lot of research evidence out there around peer support interventions in a range of health conditions, and in some cases we already have really well-established services, peer support services. So in New Zealand, spinal cord injury is a really good example of this. We already have fairly well-established services in that space. The same is not true for brain injury. In brain injury, we have much less evidence supporting peer support after brain injury, mostly because that research hasn't been done, not because there's no value in peer support. And there's been some caution when we first engaged with this project and were talking with the community about it. There was some caution about the potential for people with brain injury to take up peer support positions because of the enduring consequences of their injury. And so when we first set out on this research journey, we really wanted to address some of the gaps in evidence, but we also wanted to challenge in some ways some of the myths around the capacity of people with brain injury to be able to contribute in this way after injury. We started this work quite a long time ago. Research is always an enduring journey. So we first got funded to undertake a small feasibility study by the Health Research Council back in 2012, so more than a decade ago, which is a little bit terrifying. That feasibility study was led by our colleague, Professor Carla Kirsten, who was really one of the real early brainchilds. This was her idea to pursue this at the very early days. Soon after finishing the feasibility study, she ran away back to the UK, and so I had the opportunity to take up the leadership of the next steps in this project. Carla's still deeply involved in this work, and we still get the opportunity to connect with her virtually over the findings of this project as well. The findings of the feasibility study were really positive. So we gathered a lot of stories and experience that said to us, it's right to pursue this. We should take this forward and trial this in a more definitive way so that we can establish the evidence base to sustain peer support services in New Zealand and elsewhere. So we started applying for a number of grants. We applied 3 times before we were successful to the Health Research Council in a range of different investment schemes. So part of the delay in moving this work forward is, of course, accessing the funding to make it possible. We were eventually funded in 2000, at the end of 2018, and after spending a bit of time getting the study set up, ready to go, We ran our first training session for mentors in February 2020, which was awesome timing to start a trial of peer support after brain injury. So some of the experiences and how we responded to that is part of what I'm going to share with you today. So the research was set up as a randomised pragmatic waitlist trial with process evaluation. And our aim, when we think about what makes a pragmatic trial different from, say, a more gold standard clinical trial, a pragmatic trial is really trying to understand the effectiveness of an intervention in real-world conditions. A more gold standard randomised trial is a much more controlled environment and is more able to tell us about efficacy. Efficacy is really good, but if we then can't implement and take up those findings into practice, then it doesn't matter how efficacious something is. It's not really that helpful to us if we can't then move that through to practice. So a really key decision for us was to set this up with translation in mind at the outset of the work. We wanted to develop evidence to support peer support after brain injury, but we also wanted to produce useful, practical findings that have high utility for services in New Zealand so they can stand up peer support services, hopefully, if we can find positive findings. So that's where we started. As part of this work and trying to mimic, what real-world practice might look like if we were to set peer support up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we set up services in Auckland, Northland and Gisborne. So Chris, who you've met, was our project manager, but she also was service coordinator for the Auckland service, so she coordinated all of these activities at our local site. But then we also employed service coordinators in Northland and Gisborne to set up and support peer support in these other localities. How they were set up differed depending on locality. So in Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, for example, we had a relationship with a rehab provider there who was happy to host our service coordinator, but they weren't so keen to be responsible for employing and supporting and delivering that within their service. So we employed Kathy, who was our service coordinator in Tairāwhiti, and she was hosted by that organisation at least for a while until we all moved into lockdowns, and then we mostly worked from home in those settings anyway. In Northland, we had a different setup. We had a relationship that we developed with Te Heke Kōwora, who was a Māori health provider in Northland, and we talked to them about what would work for them. And they preferred to employ the service coordinator themselves and for them to be positioned within Te Heke Kōwora and to run the service out of there. So we then had a subcontract with them to deliver that, and part of that was their commitment to the research trial side of this as well. So each locality was set up in a slightly different way depending on the needs of that community and what worked for those host organisations. And we have gathered along the way oodles of data to really focus on these three key questions. A, to determine the impact of peer support on health and wellbeing for people after brain injury. To explore the experience and benefit for the mentors themselves. And thirdly, to explore the experience and benefit for peer support and really start to understand for whom and under what circumstances peer support might be a good pathway for someone. But our ultimate goal was to gather all of those data sources together alongside a lot of the process evaluation data that we gathered along the way to inform the development of a service framework which can be used, I guess, as a blueprint for services to stand up peer support services in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So that was our ultimate goal. Today, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the trial, but particularly actually how we responded to people in context along the way. There's this challenge and to and fro between trying to produce definitive evidence in the pragmatic trial and maintain some of the rigour of that alongside responding to what's happening in the moment and delivering peer support in the real world. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the stories that we've got from both our mentors and mentees, just to give you a sense of what that meant for them and how that was experienced by them. and then talk about some of the challenges that we have now and kind of tell the story of what we've learned along the way with these things in mind. So, the trial. I just thought that I would take you through some of the key decisions that we made along the way, both in setting up peer support as a service that can be implemented in the real world, but also how we responded to some of the COVID context and the things that we faced along the way, to give you a sense of how we shifted and responded to things as we went. So one of the first key things I really want to highlight is that we gave a lot of emphasis to lived experience as a critical component of peer support and as a critical component of how we would set up and run a service like this. And so what that meant as an example is within the peer support training, so in a moment I'll tell you a little bit about how our training sessions shifted over time in response to COVID. But actually one of the things that we maintained throughout was this really valuing and legitimising of lived experience. And so that meant what we didn't do was go with a really tailored, focused, targeted, detailed program manual. And we didn't go to training with a whole lot of information that we wanted to impart on the people attending the training. We set up the training purposely to support an interactive approach where we could draw on the experience of our mentors in that training process to gather their experience and knowledge and understanding around what peer support could be and how it could work and how they might navigate those relationships with people, rather than tell them how to do it. And so what this meant was we went with a framework and a structure and a set of activities, curated activities you might say, to help support that process. But how that rolled and played out in training was largely dependent on who was in the room and what they brought into the room. The great thing about this is that what that did for the mentors is that A, it enabled them an opportunity to share with each other, which for some of them was the first time they were in a room or virtual space with other people who had an experience of brain injury. But also, it gave them confidence that they already had the skills and knowledge that they needed to fulfill the role of mentor. So we weren't teaching them to do something different or be something different or to take on board new knowledge. We wanted them to have confidence that the knowledge and experience they already had of brain injury by virtue of having an experience of brain injury was all that they needed to fulfill this role well. We did have discussions about how to navigate complex relationships, how to keep themselves safe, and all of those kinds of things, how they might make connections with people that they're seeing for the first time. But that was all in discussion with them about how they might manage certain situations and what they thought worked for them when they were in the same situations themselves. The other thing that meant was we integrated new material into the training manual as we went. So Chris would kind of have this template, I guess, of a manual that we would want to leave with the mentors after the training. But what we learned from the mentors, like some of these discussions we had with them along the way, we integrated into the manual, and cumulatively that manual and subsequent training sessions got fuller and fuller with new experiences and ideas added into the mix based on what we learned at each training session. So that's kind of just an example of, rather than taking a sort of prescriptive approach, we really tried to embody, I guess, the value of lived experience in the process. The other thing we did, mostly in the first instance in response to COVID, but also then subsequently because it helped with managing the practicalities and logistics of doing this when we had new mentors come into line. We originally started with, so we actually on this campus in one of the gardens over here, we had our first 2-day training session, February 2020. It was awesome. We had a group of about maybe half a dozen mentors come together that day, and we had 2 full days, like a week apart, where they came in for that training. It was great to be in person. We had awesome opportunities for sharing and conversation and exchange. But by the time we got to the next lot of training, particularly with Auckland mentors, we were moving into lockdowns and it was much harder to be connecting in person in that way. So we transitioned to running online training. We reduced the training quite considerably. So instead of having 2 full days, which would be quite hard for someone with brain injury to manage online, it was hard enough managing 2 in-person days. We reduced the time down, retained 2 sessions, but really just drew on the cumulative experience of the training that we had to really focus in on some of the key things we needed to target. One of the cool things about later training sessions is that by then we had mentors who had their experience, who had already experienced being a mentor to someone, and so they would come along to the training and also support that training process and share their knowledge and learnings and experience with people as they went. One of the other things that we learned quite early, so in that very first training session here on campus, our mentors were feeling quite anxious about what it meant to deliver peer support and the need to stick to a really structured routine program. They felt quite cautious about that and were worried about, I guess, the limitations that were put on them. And so we started talking about peer support like this, where there are a number of things that you could do, but what you include in any given session with someone or meeting with someone depends on where they're at, where you're at, what the relationship dynamic is like, what's going on at that time, what you talked about last time and what you've agreed for this time, so that they can kind of, rather than see it as a strict protocol that they have to follow over 8 sessions, that they can kind of have this menu of possibilities and take out any of those activities from that menu at any given time with the person. So it provides them some guidance and some structure, but is not super prescriptive and forcing them into, you must do this in session 1 and you must do this in session 2. So they were able to really tailor their approach to meet people where they're at. We learned from the feasibility study. In the feasibility study, we had only included, I can't remember how many sessions, maybe 6 sessions over 3 months. People found it really intense and hard to fit 6 sessions into 3 months. A lot of people were immediately post-discharge from inpatient residential services and had a lot going on in their lives, and they really struggled with that intensity. So we, and they were happy to have more sessions, but they needed it over a longer period of time. So we expanded the project out to 5 months and 8 sessions, and there was no pattern over how often or frequently they had to meet. It was just whatever worked between the 2 people who were paired, with the goal of having 8 sessions within that 5-month period. So for some people that meant meeting once but then not meeting again for 6 weeks. For some people that might have meant meeting early but then we maybe had a COVID lockdown and they had a scurry of sessions at the end before 5 months was over, and that was more intense, but it just depended on what worked for them and what their availability was like. In hindsight, now that we've started looking at the data and we've started talking to some of the mentors about how they worked, we have realised that people drew on a whole range of different approaches. So each mentor had their own style, and they didn't even have a fixed style. It was all dependent on the person that they were with and what worked in that moment. And so we learned to allow for different approaches to mentoring without kind of dictating what that needed to look like or telling them how to be a mentor. All through this though, so we have a lot of fluidity and responsiveness to what's happening to people in context and how we set that up. But we still retained all the time these really, when we're analysing the data, we're trying to unpick what the key ingredients of peer support might be. It's these 3 things that we keep coming back to. So the first is that lived and shared experience. So first and foremost, that was the most critical ingredient of any mentoring relationship, was the lived and shared experience. The second thing there, connection with purpose, is really kind of highlight, you could easily see this as just really informal, two people meeting and having fun together, but actually all of our mentors took this role very seriously and were quite intentional in planning for each session and considering the kind of topics they might consider raising with someone based on their last conversation, or things that they might want to share about themselves with that person because it feels important to do so for this person's journey, what activities they might plan to do together. They were super intentional and purposeful about what they did. And then the last thing that I think is particular to how we set this up, we set this up with a focus on participation. So one of our primary trial outcomes was the extent to which we supported people to re-engage with the community and participate in life. And so each of our mentors arranged for these participatory activities with their person. What that was depended on their person. So for some people it was, walking along the beach. For others it was going to a cafe. We had people try and go bowling, but maybe they didn't get to bowling because it was closed.
No, they were trying to go paddleboarding.
Paddleboarding, right. And they went to bowling because the heat's right. So, depending on what happened, depending on what the interests were of that person or what they discussed and thought would be a good thing, depended on the types of activities. We had one of our mentors who had been a hairdresser previously. He cut the hair of at least a couple of his mentors, and that was kind of this really quite an intimate experience in some ways, but that said something about their shared connection. One of the key things about these activities was it was really different sitting across from someone, engaging in conversation and eye contact, and deeply, really kind of sharing deep experiences with someone. It's really different doing that compared to walking along the beach and doing it, or doing that while you're doing something else, or doing that while you're having a haircut. So it created a different way of engaging in a different space for connection by doing that. One of our biggest challenges in this trial was recruitment. There's potentially any number of reasons why this might have been the case. Partly that would have been the COVID context. Partly it's about this being in the context of a research trial and not just access to a service. We relied heavily on community rehab providers to refer people. We just didn't get those referrals in many cases. I have this, I've decided there's a disappearing patient phenomenon when people get discharged from inpatient residential services back to their communities, particularly those clients who are in the region. So we really struggled to get people in Tairāwhiti Gisborne, not because there might not have been people there who might want to access or benefit from peer support. We just couldn't find them at all. You like that? You're welcome to. And so what that meant though was us really needing to respond in the moment to how do we optimise recruitment, or how do we manage all of these people that do come to us but don't meet our inclusion criteria, for example. So we had an example of people coming to us who were much further post-injury, who were wanting to access peer support, but they didn't meet our inclusion criteria to access peer support. So in some cases we were able to invite them to consider if they would like to instead be a mentor, and we had one person take up that opportunity. We had a lot of people come to us with persistent difficulties following mild TBI who felt they had no access to any supports and wanted something, but they had nowhere to go. And so we ended up expanding our inclusion criteria to include mild traumatic brain injury. We'd started with only including moderate to severe TBI. We had inclusion criteria like need to have sufficient communication skills to be able to participate in the mentoring relationship. We had one man with severe aphasia who became involved, and it was just an absolute delight, and it really challenged our assumptions of what constitutes sufficient communication to participate in a mentoring relationship. In Northland, we had Deirdre, who had been set up into Hika Water. We had no one, or not many people come to her. Some people who came to her weren't looking for peer support because she persuaded they needed peer support because they did meet the inclusion criteria. But she had a whole lot of people coming to her, referred to her by GPs in the region because they were people with brain injury who needed something, but they didn't meet our criteria to take part. So she became this person in the community who could be that person that could be referred to, and she could identify what their needs were and at least try and find what supports might be available to them. They weren't part of our trial, they didn't access our trial, they didn't meet the criteria, but there was a need there, and she was able to meet that demand. The last thing I'm going to talk about here, and I'm probably going to talk too long, let me check my timing.
You have another 5.
Oh, shit, I need to go real quick. The last thing is letting go of the right match. So that one of the key things people often talk to us about and ask questions about, well, how do you decide who to match your mentor with or your mentee with? You know, what makes the right match? There's a lot of debate in the literature that we should base it on injury characteristics or demographics or ethnicity, age, gender. So there's a lot of assumptions around what makes a good match. The reality is, in this case, when we are trying to match mentors with mentees, is that we always have a limited pool of mentors available, and even within the pool of mentors that we have recruited and trained, some of them were already working with someone else, and they could be the perfect person for this, but they're not available at this moment to take up this mentoring role. And so we had to really think carefully about that matching process. People like Chris, you know, spent a lot of time engaging with the person who was seeking to access peer support, to find out more about them and find something to help that connection. But we ended up really challenging some of our assumptions of, we were worried about putting someone with severe brain injury with someone with mild brain injury. We didn't think it would work. We put those two people together, it worked beautifully. They still had a shared experience based on the symptoms they were experiencing and the impact that those symptoms were having on helping them navigate their life. And so there was always a way of finding a connection through that lived and shared experience, regardless of what other factors were going on at that time. So we got many insights through this process. Most things didn't pan out how we planned for them to pan out in this trial when we're thinking about running a trial of peer support. But nonetheless, all of these experiences are really critical and formative to how we might set up and deliver peer support services in the future. So that learning is not lost, albeit it makes it challenging to get definitive findings around the effectiveness of peer support. I'm going to try and quickly share some of the stories from people to give you some insights into how this was experienced by the people that we engaged with. So Tom was one of the very first mentors that we had training here on AUT North Campus. He has since taken up a job in New Plymouth, and this quote here is from his interview at the very end of the project, where we talked to him about his new job and the role that maybe this peer support process had in him taking up that new role. And he talks about being super excited about this job, and he says, the things that actually got me the job, I think, would have been this peer support process. It would have been all the stuff like working in the community and people's homes, sorts of things, interacting with all sorts of different people. For him, this was his first paid role. He took up other paid roles alongside this at the time, but this was a significant experience for him that he was able to put on his CV. So we didn't take for granted the lived experience people offered. We employed them to deliver peer support. So we gave them an opportunity to take up employment and use that skill and experience. He went on to mentor 3 different people over the time, over the course of the trial, but one of the people he mentored was the man with severe aphasia that I was talking about before. And this quote here is from his mum. I think that's the first time that Mark has interacted with somebody as often and to that depth since his accident. Someone who could actually understand and perhaps communicate with Mark in a way Mark that could understand. It was quite fascinating to watch that interaction between the two. Karen is one of our mentors in Whakarahi Gisborne. Karen was super anxious. Even trying to interview her at the end of the project, she was not sure about even, feeling confident enough to share her experiences. And she talked about when she was first paired with this person in Whakarahi Gisborne, she was like, well, I'm just going to have one session and I'm going to see how it goes, and if it doesn't work, well, I can say, well, at least I've tried, all is not lost. So she wasn't feeling super confident that she was going to roll with this. But then she says, the confidence building, and to know that I've still got some skills from my previous life, it kind of blew me away, I think. Just how efficient and effective I was. My experience and my strength and being able to share that with something was just for them to be so absorbent and to have such a miracle effect, it was whoa, seriously. So she turned up to that first session and we got this quote where she says, it was boom, we just totally connected. And that was it from there. And she talked about finding skills in herself that she thought she had lost through her injury in that experience of providing peer support. She mentored Deborah, who is a woman with mild traumatic brain injury. And Deborah here talks about her experience with Karen. She says she used to talk about just to make a new life, stepping over the line and saying, okay, this is my new life, I'm going to go with it. And I was definitely not in that space when I met her. I was still struggling to get back to my normal life. But after being with her, I've actually started a new life. I feel as though I'm forging a new path. She never pushed it. She never said you should do this or you should do that. She just talked and listened. It's kind of the best thing that's helped my whole concussion recovery, just having somebody you didn't have to pretend with. So Deborah was in a job that she was really struggling with. She talks through her interview about quitting that job and we were oh, not a great outcome, but then starting a new job and setting up, a new life where she could think forward. Ben is one of our mentors from Northland. He was one of our mentors who came desperately seeking peer support himself, but he didn't meet our inclusion criteria for peer support. And so we asked him, would you be interested in taking on the role of mentor? And his first response was feeling really nervous about that, but also feeling really stoked that maybe potentially he had some value that he could offer. So he had this kind of really mixed feeling. And he says here, having done it and felt like I completed it too and made a difference, I actually felt good about it. I'm getting a bit emotional, but it's been huge for me in my recovery, even it sort of gave me a purpose, a sense of purpose. I certainly felt valued. He mentored Michael. Now Michael was one of the people who Deirdre, our influence service coordinator, knew, who met the inclusion criteria, had no idea what peer support was, and really didn't care about accessing peer support. And Deirdre was like, oh,
I
need to.
What do you need to?
And so he said, I didn't even know what peer support was or what she was talking about, but I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll do it for Deirdre, kind of thing. So that's how he entered into this process. By the end of his engagement with Ben, he had so many things to share about his experience. He says here, well, it certainly works. In fact, I would have left my job by now, to be honest. Ben was the one who told me, hey, look, you're you. This is you now. Do the best you can with it. You're not going to be as good as you were before. Just run with what you've got now. You're good enough now. And Michael was thinking of leaving his job. He used to drive quite a long way every day to get to work, and by the time he got to work, he was so fatigued that he didn't feel he could competently do his job. And Ben persuaded him that he could take the bus and change up how he kind of structured his day to make that work, and highlighted all of the value that he gets from that role. And so he stayed at work and he did start taking the bus, And we asked him, well, surely like your OT, your other health professionals kind of supported you with this. He said, yeah, but the way they tried to communicate with me felt like I was being told to suck eggs type thing. And I wasn't ready to hear it, and I wasn't ready to hear it from them. But there was something about it coming from them that made a difference. So. Last story. Joe's like, last story. So Rosemary is, I was trying to remember which one Rosemary was. Right, so this is a couple of both mentor and mentee were people with mild traumatic brain injury. So Anna, who we engaged a little bit later in the project after we'd expanded our inclusion criteria, had mild TBI. And Rosemary connected with her, and she was super nervous about going out in the world at the time. She would go to the supermarket and come back feeling terrible. And so she was like, well, when she was thinking about the participatory activities for this, she's like, when we were first going, it was okay. I'm thinking this will be my one social activity for a while. And so she says, I almost like ticking it off the list is that I've done my social for the week or the 2 weeks, and I don't have to do it again for a while. But then even in the second session, I was looking forward to it because it was nice to be with someone who was like safe almost and understood. And so she started engaging with Anna in the community, having really isolated herself. And she talks about her partner noticing that when she came back after being out in the community with Anna, that she was always much more positive and confident in herself compared to what she was when she went into the community before peer support. Anna, I thought I'd finish on Anna because she was a physiotherapy student here at AUT, and she had a mild traumatic brain injury, and she took part as a mentor, and she talks here about what the experience of delivering peer support meant for her and how she has been able to since legitimise her experience of brain injury as part of who she is as a physiotherapist. And I think that's a great story to be able to finish on, particularly because we're at AUT. We have physio OT lecturers in the room, and it's kind of it's good to kind of enable people to bring the whole of themselves into who they are as a health professional. And for Anna, she struggled with that until she had taken up the role of peer support. So lots of stories that tell us something about the impact of peer support for both mentors and mentees that we engaged with over time. And I'm going to really quickly finish with this so that we can just have a conversation about it after the fact. The biggest challenge we have now is, given all of that complexity, I guess, that I've shared about running a trial, is how do we help these stories be heard, particularly when we still have this gold standard trial evidence base that says we need that definitive trial evidence to be able to fund things like this in practice. And so we're in this kind of betwixt and between space now, because where we are left with now is an underpowered trial with lots of complexity embedded in the delivery of that trial, but lots and lots and lots and lots of data that tells us that this is potentially transformative for people. And so for us, the challenge we face now is really thinking through how we tell that story to people in a way that can be heard. I've taken up too much time, so I'm not going to go through the slides. But what I will just highlight is that even when we were trying to get funding for this project, so as I said earlier, we applied 3 times for funding before it actually got funded. We were trying to really articulate this pragmatic randomised trial that can be implemented in the real world. We were applying to the health delivery stream, which required you to produce findings that could impact delivery and outcome in 3 to 5 years. So we really tailored the whole project to impact. But all of the reports and reviews that we got back were continuously standing you up against these gold standard trial criteria. And so, even back then, over 3 years of applying for different grants, we were fighting against this hierarchy of evidence and what constitutes legitimate evidence for us to be able to take things up in practice. And so we know we've got this challenge ahead of us to try and have these findings heard. And COVID, of course, made that all the more complex for us as well. But we have these stories to tell, so we just got to figure out how to do that well. That's it from me. I'm going to finish on this wonderful picture. It was a group of our mentors who came back to AUT a few months ago so that we could share some of our early thinking and findings with them and get their input into these findings. So all acknowledgement to people like this and to people like Chris, Joe, Greta, a range of people who of course have been part of this trial and helped make it happen.